So hi, welcome to our panel. This is our Selves as Others, creative spaces between fact and fiction. We are going to discuss what fiction and non-fiction can do for each other. We started with a few questions. Why is fiction an authentic way to write about science? Is there truth in fantasy? How will fictionalized biography help to keep a family together? And we are basically discussing, does the label fact or fiction change the truth of the story? Why would an author choose to write about their own life or the life of their family in a fiction and a non-fiction way? And what is the risk in fictionalizing non-fiction? What is the reward? So my name is Joanne Anderton. I'm a speculative fiction writer. I usually write science fiction, fantasy, and horror, but I have started branching out recently into kids' books and also creative nonfiction. I'm just at the beginning of a PhD, a creative writing PhD, where I'm writing what we're calling a speculative fiction autobiography, and I'm using speculative fiction to write the true story of my time living in and teaching English in rural Japan. So I'm coming at this from an attitude of, yeah, there's truth in speculative fiction, just as there's truth in creative nonfiction. And so that's me, and I'm going to hand over to our other panelists to introduce themselves.
Hi, everybody. I'm Amanda Niehaus. I began sort of my career as a scientist. So I have a PhD in biology that I obtained 15 years ago now. And in the course of kind of driving myself toward an academic career in biology, I realized that I was actually more interested in communicating science. And I thought initially that that was going to be, you know, magazine articles or nonfiction books. And then I took my first class in fiction and my whole life changed. And now I consider myself a huge advocate for the ways that fiction can share science with the world. And so that's where I'm coming here today. I've also just started a second PhD, this time in creative writing, where I'm looking at how writers use the science of time in their novels and short stories. And I'm really excited to be here today. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rachel Laundy. I'm doing an MPhil at UQ in creative writing as well. I've often written at that intersection of fiction and non-fiction, with whether that's using true events or speculative fiction and fantasy. My current project is a novella set in the late 1960s in Australia, and it tells the true story of my parents' experiences at that time. So I guess what interests me with this topic is that while I'm aiming to write an authentic tale using lots of accurate historical details, the final product will be a work of fiction. So looking forward to talking about that today.
Tēnā koutou, my name's Pip Adam. I'm coming from to you from Te Atiawa, Taranaki Whānui and the neighbouring Ngāti Toa Iwi land. I'm very grateful to be here and just pay my respects to mana whenua. I write fiction. Well, it's always been called fiction, but I'm not sure whether that's how I'd describe it. I am always interested in writing to try and work out what I think of things or to try and understand the world that I live in. So I find that fiction is an interesting way of getting at truths. And that was something I was really interested in all of your work as well. And I don't know, like, if it isn't out of turn, I was wondering if maybe I could open up asking about this line between fact and fiction, and if any of you have anything to say about this line between fact and fiction.
Yeah, please. No talking out of turn. We're all discussing. Yeah, guys, Amanda, Rachel, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I can start off because I realized in my introduction I didn't tell you either that I actually have a published novel, which I'm super proud of. It came out in 2019. It's just there on the bookshelf, strategically placed. It's called The Breeding Season, and I think for me, this novel really showed me how I could draw upon the facts of my lives in a fictionalized way. I think when I came to fiction, I had this idea that I had to make everything up out of my head, out of thin air. And that was terrifying, because then you can write about anything, anywhere, any time. And the scope is just so vast that it can actually be paralyzing, I think. And so for me, beginning with my own experiences as a scientist was a really solid way to start. So the book, The Breeding Season, is actually based a lot on the research I was doing in my scientific career when I was writing it, which was studying how native marsupials in Australia trade off the energy that they spend in reproduction with the energy that basically keeps their bodies going and keeps them alive. So we have a number of really cool species here in Australia that invest so much into breeding that they die soon after. They just give everything. And I was always really interested in that trade-off scientifically, of course. Like how does that happen in the body, and what sort of environmental characteristics affect this, and why, in the case of northern quolls, which are kind of a small marsupial carnivore, why is it only the males that give so much and not the females? The females actually live 2 or 3 years. And so I started thinking about this through my own perspective as a woman in science, for example, a mother, a partner, a person who had a creative side as well that I wanted to explore progressively. And I just thought, if I leave this information in a bunch of academic articles, it's a waste, right? If I can translate this stuff into my own life, or into the life of characters who might be like me or might have the same kinds of struggles that I have, then I might be able to communicate some of this really cool science in a much broader way. And so I found it really, really useful in the case of my own fiction writing to draw from that place of my experience as a starting point. And then, I would gain confidence, and the character, she became someone who's not like me at all. But in the beginning, it was so comforting to start with someone that I knew very well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so interesting, like when you say that, because I think in a weird way I have had a similar experience starting on the other side, because like I've always only written, speculative fiction, right? Like the weirder, the better. And I kind of believed that was my only genre. That was the only way I knew how to write anything. And I would still get quite bolshy when people sort of tell me that it's mere escapism. There's nothing of substance in speculative fiction. But I did a master's in creative writing a few years ago, and it was a coursework master's, and one of the things we had to do was creative nonfiction, and I was terrified because I was like, I don't know, I can't do fact. I don't know how to do real. I only know how to do speculative. But I had the most amazing teacher, and as I was doing it, I realized that actually what I was doing with creative nonfiction, with taking fact and weaving it in, and making it fictionalized in some way, but not fictionalized, but making it sound like a story, was what I was already doing, except with speculative fiction, but I didn't realize. So none of my an example was like a story I was working on at the time. On the surface is a story of a couple who go out spacewalking and get lost, and then eventually possibly find their way back. And it's about space and spaceships and ruins, but it's actually the real story of my real story that was going on at that same time. But I was translating it into speculative fiction without realizing that I was talking truth in that spec fic anyway. And it was such a revelation to me at that moment. It's like, I was already doing this. I've always been doing this. And now I'm just being a bit more explicit about it. Yeah. There you go.
I think there's the fiction novel is always truthful in some way, but it can get away with anything. As soon as you start talking about fact, there's the expectation that that fact will be used conscientiously and ethically, and that readers will expect different things of the work, and critics as well, of course. And so the way that readers approach a book that uses fact is really different to the way they approach a book that is straight fiction. So I guess that is sort of what interests me when I'm starting to incorporate the lots of research that I like to do and that I've always done as part of my work career as well, is incorporating that in. And where do you draw the line though? How do you do it in a way that isn't going to tread on toes or use things in an unethical way? So that's questions as well. But what do you think? How do you draw that line?
And Pip, what do you, because you've posed the question, but you've got out of answering the question.
Yeah, that's my style. One thing I was thinking as people were talking, and I really loved what you all said, was that I was just thinking that sometimes this distinction between a creative or imaginative work and a scientific work is quite sort of Western centric. And I was thinking, I know that the peoples around where I live, like this is how scientific information was often transmitted, was through art or through story or song. And I was just thinking about how a lot of these ideas and a lot of these distinctions kind of fall away. I really like what Rachel said about the ethical use of it, and it's kind of blown my mind a little bit, a lot. And I was just thinking about how often what I'm trying to do is record contemporary scientific thought. Like my last novel dealt a lot with like the idea of what's real and what's not real, and simulation theory. And I guess what I was trying to do there was maybe even a historical kind of action rather than a scientific action, was to try and capture the feeling of that science rather than catching the facts. I'm not convinced of that. I may change my mind tomorrow, but I think this idea of ethics is so interesting.
And there's another interesting component to the discussion of ethics too, in that research has shown that people remember the facts they learn from fiction just as well as they remember those from nonfiction. So in a sense, I mean, it's one thing to sort of take an idea and run with it. It's another. I think we have to be careful when we're writing fiction that we are as truthful as we can be in things that might particularly matter, particularly, in lives now, like around climate change, or around vaccinations, or around some of these big contemporary scientific issues. I think it's very important to do that extra research and find out as much of the fact as possible, and to consider at least being as true to that fact as possible, even within the context of fiction.
Definitely. And I come from I used to work in publishing and marketing and distribution for a long time. And so I can't not come at it with that baggage. Like I especially when we're talking about distinctions of genre, and like a lot of the research and the reading I'm doing as I do this work is about how truth and fiction, how nonfiction, fiction, they weave, can we really make the distinction? But when you're going into a bookstore to buy a book, when you're pitching to a publishing house to sell a book, when you're looking online to find something, those distinctions are really there. We can't escape that. When you're looking at the breakdown of sales on different, everything is done by genre, and being able to, you couldn't stand there and say, oh, but it's, and I'm going to come across this myself, but you couldn't stand there and say, oh, but it doesn't fit into any genre. It doesn't, it could go anywhere in the bookshelf, and that immediately is a reason for them not to want to buy it. So I love the ideas around destabilizing genres, but I come at it with a healthy commercial skepticism.
Absolutely. And I think in practice, when people go to buy nonfiction, they know they're going to learn something. That's kind of, to me, the whole point. And fiction, I mean, I guess on a philosophical level, you will learn something, but you're not going in with that intention to sort of gain knowledge on a topic. And so I think you have to be careful not to, maybe also not to kind of shove something in your reader's face that they're not ready for.
You're it's the hidden vegetable of
Yes, yeah, the brownies. That's how you get the fact into fiction.
You're baking your science in with some chocolate.
Oh yeah.
I'm really interested in this idea of speculation as well, Jo. Like, I was thinking that the question is a really interesting form, like we're this amazing thing where speculative, like a speculation or a thought experiment or those sorts of things. And I'd love to talk to the philosophers in the room, but like, I just think that it's so interesting where that sits. We always tag the word fiction on the end of speculative fiction, and this idea of a hypothesis in a scientific experiment, or I'm really excited by the discussion about that as well. It's really cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I use the word speculative fiction very specifically because, and again, that's where I'm coming from with my writing. So when I say spec fic, like I mean science fiction, fantasy, horror. But there are, it's a rainbow of speculation, and there is some speculative fiction, well, some speculation in fiction that is none of those things. But that's exactly what I mean, and I'm sort of I'm excited by playing with that notion that like this thing is obviously not true, but it is true because I'm telling you it's true. And that comes back to that line that we were talking about a bit earlier. If you have to clarify that something is true, what does that mean? There's an extra weight to it, and then the ethical dimension as well, because what I'm doing is entirely my story, so I feel like I have possibly less, I don't know, maybe I should be ethically inclined towards myself, but I'm less so.
Yeah, I guess that's you do have control of your material and your story. It's your story. I am telling my parents' story, so there is a different ethical responsibility there, not just to my parents, but to my broader family. But I'm also telling the story set in a time that I didn't live through. So I feel like it's a responsibility to also represent that as accurately as possible. And so I feel like that distinction between accuracy and authenticity becomes really, really important. And that, I do aim for the authentic and credible story via using lots of accurate detail. But there may be other ways. I don't know. What do you think?
Rachel?
Yeah. No, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, what are some of the sort of practical ways that you're addressing this?
Yeah, okay. So that's obviously with these MPhils and PhDs in universities, you get the critical component as well. And so that's the topic of the critical component, is sort of working out where those decision points occur in the writing process and flagging them. Reading a lot of criticism of other works that have gone before, and seeing where these things have been criticised, and then showing how they can be resolved. So there's heaps of different things, too many to cover here, but just briefly, I guess there's that accuracy and authenticity that I talked about. Simple things like changing names. You've got presentism, which is viewing the past through the moral lens of the present. So, you can't make characters think, feel and do what they wouldn't have done at the time. And bowerbirding, there's lots of things that you can do. And I guess being aware of all of that and then making those choices to the extent that you want is kind of the point of what I'm trying to work out at the moment.
Yeah, that was going to be my question as well.
Great minds, Joe, great minds.
Yeah, totally.
Hopefully it answers them.
Can I ask a question?
Wait another year and a half.
Can I ask a question to anyone about the speculative? Because it just was interesting thinking as you were talking, Joe, about, you know, what the speculative elements mean for truth. And so do you think, you know, do you think that those elements destabilize our assumptions of reality, or like the things that we take for granted? And what do you think that kind of destabilization could do for the reader or for us as writers?
Pip, do you want to, I feel very conscious of not doing too much talking. So Pip, do you want to have because I know you're also keen on the speculation.
Oh, I think, yeah. Thank you for that. I was thinking one of the things I really like about this sort of zone is that sometimes it's hard to think outside of a current hierarchy of power. And so it's really hard to redistribute power within that hierarchy of power. So often that destabilization, I'm doing it for that reason, so that, you know, in that way, I'm really interested in the work of like Octavia Butler and Samuel Delaney and people like that, where there's an ability to sort of destroy our current sort of structure in order to perhaps look at it and say, well, why do we think that's right? You know, like here's a world where it's different. I don't know. What do you think, Joe?
I mean, I totally agree with you, but I feel like I come at it from a very sort of personal, insular kind of way of looking at it, which I've been doing a lot of reading and a lot of thinking about how the narratives we tell about ourselves are not like they create ourselves in the telling. Amanda will know this because she's read some of my recent rambles. But yeah, and if that's true, so if the way we tell stories, you know, if we create ourselves as we tell them, then the forms that we use to tell those stories become extra important because they're kind of shape us even as they shape the stories. And I feel that there's that level of destabilization that you get when you kind of you take this thing that we on a surface everyday level think is obviously truth, like there's this truth, right? Like I truthfully know that this pen exists. But if we take that and we mess around with it to the point where, you know, whether or not that pen exists, how do you feel at this moment? Like what you actually thinking about 2 seconds ago? Was that real? Was it somewhere else? You're messing with this whole line between the physical world outside and the mental soft world inside. And I feel like when you do that, you possibly open up spaces where you can create versions of yourself that are actually more, and that goes back to that authenticity versus truth, that's something more authentic. And particularly those of us who don't necessarily fit within, and maybe this goes back to the hierarchical structures, because when those of us who don't necessarily fit within identities that are assumed to be okay, normal, commonplace, maybe that gives us the potential, gives us the space to exist in a way. I don't know. Please.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And it makes me think about one of the things that, so my husband and I take a different approach, for example, to arguing. Like I'm like a pacifist all the way, and his mind is always like constructing logical arguments. And so if he, you know, decides to argue a point, I'm basically like, I'll write a novel about it, and then I'll tell you how I feel, because for me, it's actually a long process to think through how I think about something. And write, and actually legitimately writing fiction enables me to do that, because I think fiction lets me play around with context. And when you were talking about these different dimensions of yourself, to me, like I totally relate to that, Joe, because I feel like I can throw different elements of who I am into different characters, put them in a situation and see what happens. And in the end, it's almost like being in one of those like halls of mirrors where I get all these different versions of myself that, you know, that are looking back at me. And it's kind of a way of exploring how I feel about something or how I see myself. And yes, that's really interesting that you said that.
Yeah, and it's I think it also, like, it gives me the opportunity, like, I'm one of these writers or people, I don't know, people in general, who, like, most of the time, if I'm walking down the street, I'm not actually walking down the street. I am somewhere else, and that other where else is a whole other world else. And so there's no point trying to talk about an experience I've had, pretending that that other world doesn't exist. One of the stories that I'm writing as part of this project is about, so I used to work at a school, and every morning I would walk 5-10 minutes to get to the school. And there was I'd walk past these old tennis courts. And there was this old man who was in there dancing every morning with nobody, just dancing by him, like just as though he was holding someone. And so every morning I would imagine, like, oh, who are you dancing with today? What is happening here? And I realized that I could not talk about that walk to school without talking about what this man could have been dancing with, whether or not it was a memory or a ghost or another reality. Maybe he was seeing something that none of us could see. Maybe he wasn't there. Maybe I was seeing him, all of this stuff. And I think it wouldn't be truth, in inverted commas, without that thing that was not factual. Yeah. Yeah. Which, I don't know if anyone's got any other thoughts. Rachel.
No, I just want to read that story now.
Well, we can do that, yeah. One of the questions we had on our list of questions, which we have not really been using, which is totally fine, is, does the label fact or fiction change the truth of the story? And I mean, I think we touched on it a little bit about the difference between, you know, nonfiction and fiction in a bookshop, and truth and fact and authenticity. But before we moved on, I just wanted to make sure if anyone had any other things to say to that. And I feel like I've been talking a lot about spec fic, so any other genres, please, Amanda.
Yeah, I'm actually curious about this too, like, because I know there's a whole trend about you know, the whole based on a true story thing tagline in films or in books. And I don't know if you have any insight from the publishing industry on this, like what that actually does. But it seems to be, I have a feeling like it's a positive thing in the publishing world. And I just wonder how that gets decided, you know, what is, like, how much does it have to be true? And yes.
Yeah, like I couldn't tell you exactly how much it has to be true. But I can tell you from a marketing point of view, if you can say that this is based on a true story, or, you know, it has so much more traction than just fiction. And even more so when your fiction is science fiction, or, and I can talk to my personal experience of publishing science fiction novels, you know, which did okay, and then publishing a kid's book, which was based on my dad, and suddenly the publicity we got out of that it was night and day. Even though one was a very small kid's book with pictures, you know, and the other was a trilogy of big fat books, you know, like, but you still get the interest is really yeah, it's really different. Rachel, can I ask you, when this project is finished, when your book, will you be based on a true story?
Yeah, I guess it will be, but it feels a bit vulgar to go, it's a marketing ploy. But yeah, I guess I am more interested in stories that do have some sort of factual element. I love nonfiction books, but then I also really love spec fic, but I feel like it is, you know, often a projection of scientific advances that are happening at the time of what, you know, what it might happen in 20, 100 years. So I feel like there's, yeah, I think almost anything could say based on a true story. But yes, I guess I will be. I'll also have that disclaimer though that, you know, it is a work of fiction, and that the story, while it has some elements that are true, it isn't. And that's important to protect my family. And yeah, so I think, I don't know yet. We'll see how that plays out. I don't have a lot of experience with marketing.
Mm-hmm. Pip, do you have any insight from your experience?
I think what's really interesting is that I was reading an article about this idea of sort of parasocial relationships today, and I think that there is a desire for truth and for that projection of the author. I think that my experience is that people are interested in that, and I find that interesting. And I just loved what Rachel was saying about that idea of you know, like as I read a work that's kind of based on a true story, it's that wonderful thing of sort of detangling what is and what isn't factual, kind of, or truthful. And I find that really, really interesting. I was thinking a little bit, I got to do a workshop with Maria Tumarkin last year, and like she is quite staunch about the difference between fiction and non-fiction. Well, she was on that day, and what I really liked about what she said is that non-fiction has an energy about it that I don't think I can get from a novel, if you know what I mean. Like there is this energy to it. I don't know how to describe it apart from that, but you know, there's this intrigue and energy around it that I think it's almost impossible to get from a novel. I'm always worried when I say things in absolutes, because tomorrow I'll be thinking differently. But yeah, I think it's such an interesting question.
Yeah, like this whole but you know, if we do think that from fiction we get the truth of feeling rather than the truth of fact, it does seem, I don't know, almost counterproductive to make that argument, but still but still, yeah, yeah, it happens a lot, and you do get a lot of people who just blatantly say, I only read nonfiction, I only read fiction, I only read big fat fantasies, you know. Yeah.
And I was just thinking there could be an interesting, you know, like I'm thinking of those cases that we've had over the years where people have presented something as non-fiction and it's turned out to be fictional. I guess that would be, I'm trying to work out the perfect experimental lab for it. And I was just wondering if you know, the way people feel before and after that might be a way of working out if there is a difference. I don't know, but yeah, sorry, I just had to interject with that. I was just thinking about it.
Do not be sorry, please, Amanda. Yes.
Yeah, I've always had this this idea of a book that's half fiction and half nonfiction, and that like the reader could choose which to read first, and how cool it would be to sort of test how the reading of one side versus the other affected the reading of the subsequent.
Yeah. Oh,
somebody do that.
Those choose your own adventure stories where you could like, that would work well with that. I'm just going to flip to what really happened, and now I'm going to flip to what I imagine happened. That's awesome. Love it.
Yeah. That would be cool. We should do that. Let's make one of those.
Yeah.
That'd be cool. Yeah.
In our spare time, in the midst of all our other books and projects.
So much spare time. I don't know what you're talking about. But yeah, I know, like there's instances where something is marketed as nonfiction and then comes out as actually being not true. And the sense of betrayal that people feel is really interesting, because like even when we accept something as nonfiction, accept something is supposedly true, there is a part of us that knows that it's not 100% true, because that's impossible, right? Like no one can ever, I don't know if, I mean, maybe I only think like this because this is part of what I'm researching, but at no point can you ever read anything or watch anything and know that this is 100% real, because it isn't, right? It's in words, and we have to plug the gaps in our minds, or it's done through a particular director's vision, or yeah. So even though part of us must know that that is not possible, we still feel very deeply personally betrayed when we are lied to.
Yeah, it's about that contract, isn't it? It's about sort of, and maybe that's one thing that regardless of what you're writing, whether it sits firmly in one side or the other or somewhere between, that you show the reader what you're giving them straight up and that you maintain that all the way through.
Yeah. And a lot of that contract is outside of your control necessarily as a writer. A lot of it does come from what the book looks like, where it is on the shelf, how it's marketed. And, you know, it's obviously not the same level, but the difference between science fiction and fantasy is one thing that those of us who are really into it, you know, get cranky. Well, I get cranky when somebody's like, this is fantasy. I know that's quite obviously science fiction. I'm sorry. There is a difference, I think, anyway. So we've got about 10 minutes left for our timing. Shall we talk very quickly about what the risk is in fictionalizing nonfiction versus the reward? And then maybe talk to some sort of that practical toolbox that we were hoping to end up with at the end. Anyone want to take it away with the risk versus reward? You can't tell, Rachel, but I'm looking at you.
Okay, me. Yeah, all right. So obviously the risk is that my family will never speak to me again, broader family as well as immediate family. So there's that risk of putting my family's deep, dark secrets out there into the public space. So I guess the reward of fictionalizing a lot of this fact is that it does obscure what is true and what isn't. And as Pip said, you know, it shouldn't be, you can possibly disentangle it throughout the novel, but I don't think it won't be important enough to try and work out what is true and what is not. It'll be untrue enough to protect what my family requests to be protected. And yes, I guess those are my risks and rewards for using that combination.
Mm-hmm.
I think from a scientific or from a science perspective, I think a lot of writers would feel nervous. I'm feeling nervous at the moment because my first book was very much in the world of biology, which I was familiar with. And now I'm studying a lot of physics, and just, you know, there's big physics ideas that make your brain hurt after a while. And I think there's this fear that I'm now feeling myself that we're going to get it wrong. Like that if you approach something that's quite complex and hard to understand, that you might, you know, do it a disservice, or you might be called out for your mistakes, or that it's above you, that you shouldn't be messing around with these ideas. And I just think that's, I think that holds it back a lot of writers. And I really just think that we have to do the best that we can, and do the research, you know, as deeply as we can in different contexts, you know, like talk to people. I think so many scientists are just really, really open to talking about the work that they're doing, that really enthusiastic. And if you come to them with this, like, okay, I'm writing a book about this and I don't quite understand, you know, how I might use this principle, you know, most of the people that I know in science would sit down and sort of have a really helpful and useful conversation with the writer about that. And so I just think we have to kind of let ourselves feel a little bit vulnerable sometimes when we're working with fact, in order to potentially make what I see as incredible gains. Because to me, the gains are around getting science, which is often kind of locked up in obscure journals behind paywalls, out into the greater community, contextualized into human lives, so that, you know, we might see, for example, like in the case of my book, you might see how the trade-offs that happen between male and female marsupials are actually quite aligned with the trade-offs that we have in, you know, modern human families. And it helps bring those ideas home. So I just think the benefits are huge, and also that as writers, we should be looking for ways to support each other in sort of jumping into these areas that terrify us a little.
Mm-hmm. can I very quickly ask you, Amanda? So I've read people's, not criticism as such, but an opinion that we shouldn't make scientific stuff sort of easily consumable, entertaining. It should be factual. It should be. I mean, I think I know what your attitude to that would be, but I just do you think there is a risk in entertaining, making science entertaining and therefore reducing it in some way? Or
No, but I have read books over the last couple of years, and I won't name names, but there have been a couple instances where people obviously didn't do the research, like they didn't work hard enough, and that's a bit frustrating because then you have these ideas perpetuating that were because of laziness rather than because they really tried and made an effort. And but overall, I think any sort of scientific or philosophical or historical or any of these big ideas should be accessible to the greatest number of people possible. And to do that, we have to be able to speak these ideas in many different languages, and using languages here metaphorically, like we have to be able to translate in order to reach different people. And so absolutely stories should go everywhere.
Yeah, I kind of thought I knew the answer, but I just thought. Pip, what's your take on the risk of fictionalizing a nonfiction?
First of all, I really, really loved that. Thank you so much for that question, for Amanda. I really enjoyed that and loved it. And I was just thinking how for me, the risk and the reward are sort of really enmeshed in each other. And, what I'm interested in, the reward that I get from writing about factual things in fiction is, this idea of sort of trying to imagine different futures, this idea of fluidity, this idea of perhaps changing minds and changing perspectives and making it possible to look at things in new ways. But of course, that in itself makes the risks, this idea, the extent to which the book is written by the reader is something that I think about a lot. And the fact that some of the ideas could be turned around in a way that I didn't intend. And I also think one of the risks for me is that there's a temptation for me to make the facts fit the story, which I need to be really careful of. Like, I always try to be sort of led by the facts rather than the story. It's at the moment I'm writing a lot about sound, and it's very tempting. There are some misunderstandings that I had around some of the science around sound, and I was like, oh, I love my misunderstandings, and it's okay to present those. But as Amanda was saying earlier, there's a real need for me to sort of signpost when I'm doing that, I think, in the work. And I really love what people have talked about those real life consequences of writing. I think that in the past, I thought I could write like it had no effect, but I particularly related to what Rachel was saying, there are real life consequences. And, I used to sort of hide behind this idea of fiction, but now I try and think that I'm writing something slightly different from fiction. But it's a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. Do we want to have a quick talk about practical toolboxes for writers? Amanda, I know you're very keen to do this, so would you like to start?
I just like to talk, apparently. There are so many ways for people to engage with science. So another thing I'll sort of signpost for people watching is that I co-produce an online magazine called Science Right Now, which is at sciencerightnow.com, that publishes creative writing inspired by science and the lives of scientists. And so we hope that is a place that people can go for inspiration. But I'm always looking in kind of old books and, online, just for ideas or images that I can use to think about form. I like to sort of imagine myself in the perspective of a scientist who has a particular curiosity. You don't have to imagine that you have all the knowledge that they have, but imagine if you've been studying something for a long time, you would have a natural curiosity about that thing. And so looking at an object or an idea with a kind of new curiosity or from a new angle, I think is a really important thing to do. But just sort of being open to anything that gives you that little like ding in your head, follow it and see what happens. And there are so many ways too that I think you can use science as, you know, as metaphor. You can use it to shape a story. So, you know, my first book, The Breeding Season, is actually shaped by the lives of the male and female northern quolls. So the trajectories that the characters follow are very similar to the animals in that way. So they're just, yeah, it's just really exciting. I hope that people, you know, keep their minds open.
Cool. Rachel?
I guess tying back in a few of the things that we've spoken about, the risk versus the reward, within historical and biographical fiction, using fact, and as Pip was saying before, it can be kind of dangerous. I think Amanda mentioned right back at the beginning that readers will take away quite a lot from a fictional novel. So it does mean that there is a bit of an onus on the writer when they are using historical fact to treat that with respect, and not conflate big historical details for the sake of the fiction. So I guess that would be one of the biggest ones that I'm going to be aware of when I'm doing my research, is trying to keep historical events in place, in time, intact, as much as possible, so that they aren't misremembered in the future.
Can I ask a quick question, Rachel? So are you using like your parents' old diaries and stuff? Like, did they keep diaries?
I wish. That would be so convenient. No, they did write each other hundreds of letters, and after they got married, they had a little burning ceremony. So I don't have access to what would have been rather rich fodder, but luckily they're good storytellers and they have good memories. So I'll use what I can.
Yeah, cool.
Pip, would you have any practical toolbox takeaways?
Yeah, oh, I love this conversation. I was just thinking about that idea of writing into the gaps, and you know, sometimes it's actually yeah, it's a real gift when people burn things. I don't know. I think that sometimes, I don't know. I was thinking I love that word curiosity, and I was also thinking how at the moment a lot of my work, I'm wondering how to build in consent into writing. You know, often I write about violence, and I have this desire to write about you know, like my book at the moment is largely based on incarceration and prisons, based on some of the work that I've done in there. And like I sometimes want to write these things, but I'm really interested in how craft can build in consent, like how the language can signal when we're moving into factual, when we're moving into fiction, when we're moving into areas that are difficult. And in that way, I guess I'm going real old school homo and thinking a lot about the book as an artifact, you know, like that it's a pretense, that it's a performance. And so, you know, that's a lot of what I'm thinking about at the moment. And just like really going back to craft and those very old books where it was sort of stories and you know, there was an authorial voice that would explain where things were going to happen, and just kind of training my ear to a lot of those things. And yeah, and of course looking at another thing that I've been doing is looking at the artistic or creative output from other times. You know, like recently or last year we did a panel on the plague, the Camus, you know, like just this idea of what did people write you know, during the Second World War and the aftermath of the Second World War, or the beginning of the Second World War. And yeah, so I guess that doesn't sound very practical at all. That sounds ridiculous, but I just think that it's really interesting to look at the tools of the trade. Like I'm always interested in that. Like all I'm dealing with is kind of black scratches on a white page, and how can I use those to sort of make sure that a reader has some guidance around the book. But yeah, now I sound like a control freak. Oh yeah, but yeah, I think everything everyone said is so interesting. I love it so much.
I think that sounds really practical, because there's like an almost fairy tale sort of tradition of, and now I'm going to tell you a story that, and the stories within stories, that is, I think, a really powerful tool, being aware of the storyness of the thing that we are doing, regardless of how much truth or not truth we're trying to put in it. I think it's really important. But maybe especially when you're dealing with levels of blurring the line between real and not real, and and that kind of goes back to the whole thinking of the I think Pip, you said something earlier that really struck me about not letting the story take away, decide what the facts are going to do, let it doing it the other way around. And that's been a real concern that I've been having, because I've got like notes of the stuff that I did, and things that I want to follow, but I want to tell them in a way that is also an interesting science fiction story. So I can't necessarily structure them along those lines, though, because they didn't happen that way. Life doesn't happen in 3 acts. Life doesn't have a denouement or whatever. But yeah, I think that's a very interesting and important thing to consider, which is, we are telling stories, and stories are artificial constructs, and life is not, possibly. And I think that we have now totally run out of time, because my little timer has now gone beyond 45 minutes. So I think that means that we're out of time. Does anyone have any final thoughts to leave the session on?
Thank you, Jo.
Thank you, Jo. Thank you so much. And thanks, Rachel and Amanda. It was awesome.
It was really, really good to have this discussion. I wish it went for longer.
I know. I've been watching the time going really fast, thinking we've got so much more to talk about. But yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Pip and Rachel and Amanda.